It's my great pleasure to introduce Bob Carlin today. So Bob is one of the leading experts on the situation in North Korea, and perhaps more than the political side, Bob has spent decades understanding the North Korean people, the North Korean policies, and how how they influence each other. And I hope you get today a different perspective, a deeper perspective, not just the surface sound bites of what's going on in North Korea, but a more deeper understanding of the situation now and how we can move forward. So with that, I'll introduce Bob, but remember, questions on cards. Anytime, Skip will be jumping around, dancing around the room, collecting your cards, and I will be curating them before they go to Bob. So with that, Bob, welcome to Reno, and welcome to the National Security Forum.
Last night I made the mistake of not having my glasses with me, so I got them. You know, when Maureen said you have 5 more minutes, I've been doing so much traveling that immediately it flipped a switch in my mind that said, we're about to begin our descent. If you want to visit the restroom, you should do so now, and put your laptops underneath. So I can't. Yeah. Is that better? Okay, very good. For those of you who were at the dinner last night, and for those of you who weren't, I described some personal impressions of North Korea. And I want to make sure that you don't come away thinking I thought I was in Disneyland and this was a place where Snow White, walks along and the birdies plait her hair and chirp, chirp, chirp. It's a tough, ugly place. There's no doubt about it. But that does not mean that they're not real people, that they're not Koreans, that the place does not function like something on planet Earth. That was the only point I was trying to make. Because the two-dimensional view that is portrayed of North Korea, generally in the media and by the commentaries, deprives us of our ability really to see what we're up against and what the opportunities are. That was the point, and I'm going to try to continue that this morning. I really have 3 tasks, I think, this morning, 3 questions to answer. What do we know about North Korea? How do we know it? And where do we go from here? And whatever I don't cover in this opening presentation, I'm sure we're going to get to in the Q&A. So let's start with number 2. How do we know about North Korea? The general impression is that North Korea is a black hole, and you'll hear some people say that. There are some people in Washington who will tell you that nobody knows anything about North Korea. My view is when you hear somebody say that, you should count the silverware, because what they're saying, in effect, is since nobody knows anything, I can say anything I want, and nobody can contradict me. Well, ain't true. We know a lot about North Korea. We know a lot more about North Korea than we did when I started in 1974, when about the only thing people knew about North Korea was watching MASH on television. In 1974, the intelligence community was almost entirely focused on North Korea as an I&W program, indications and warning. If you had a meeting on North Korea, it could be filled with military analysts, almost no political analysts or economic analysts. Nobody was interested. Nobody cared. When something went wrong in North Korea, there was one solution: send a carrier. And that was as far as our thinking went. Well, over the last several decades, we've learned more about North Korea. If you look on the internet these days, actually you'll find a phenomenal amount of information if you know how to look at it. People, especially visual information, which is very important, but there are a lot of reports. Lots of people go in and out of North Korea, NGOs, international organization people, academics, tourists. If you can read Chinese or Russian, there's even more. And from, I can't remember when it was, maybe 2009 through 2013, I was a contractor, CIA contractor, on an unclassified program called Open Source Works. And this was congressionally mandated, and the purpose of it was to figure out if the intelligence community, by truly exploiting open source materials, we could learn a lot more on important places in the world. North Korea was one of them. There were several others. And so 7 days, or 5 days a week, I did it 7 days, but 5 days a week, you just mined the internet. You cannot believe how much we learned about North Korea, about ground level truths in North Korea. Now, some people will say, well, yeah, but that's not the most important stuff. You didn't learn anything about the nuclear program. And no, there are technical things you will not learn from unclassified sources. But there's a lot more to the world, a lot more that's important about the world than is available in classified information. I haven't used classified information since I left Bureau of Intelligence Research in 2004, maybe. And I don't miss it. I know what I'm missing. I know what I don't know because I don't have access. But for all the years I worked on North Korea, I know that our sources were very limited, and that what we learned about North Korea and what was important about North Korea was mostly what you could learn on the outside. Technical things, no. The United States has the best technical collection services that exist, and they give us a leg up on a lot of important subjects, and they have helped us catch the North Koreans in untruths many times, and so that's important. But if you want to know about North Korea, seriously, the best single source, day in and day out, is North Korean media. It's what they say to the world. People say sometimes, well, there's no news in North Korea. Well, of course there's no news in North Korea. That's not the point. The point is that they are constantly sending signals, either to the outside or to other countries. Not everything is aimed at us, although we think it is, or internal signals, things that they're trying to tell their own people. I developed, and I'll run through this part of it quickly, but when I was teaching a class at Stanford called Reading North Korea, I had a group of really smart students. They were scary. They were so smart. And I had to try to figure out how to fix in their minds a methodology that I was trying to teach them to use, to apply when you're reading North Korean media. And I was sitting in Pete's coffee shop. And I looked at the menu, and suddenly it occurred to me, latte. I can teach them something I will call the Latte Method, and they'll never forget it. Because what is latte? Well, the point about how do you read North Korean media is that there's a systematic methodology you can use. I didn't invent it. This is something that was used actually against the Germans and the Japanese in World War II, subsequently developed for use against the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China and Eastern Europe. It's a very serious, well-developed, and proven time after time methodology for understanding a controlled media. Latte. First thing you worry about is the level. Not everything that you see, for example, in North Korea media is equally valuable. Some of it is junk. It's just propaganda. You don't have to worry about it. It's fluff. So you cast it aside. What you're looking for is the most authoritative or somewhat authoritative output. How do you recognize that? Well, the North Koreans, as the other controlled media did, try to make it pretty clear to you. They have a hierarchy of authority. Once you begin to understand what that hierarchy is, you begin to understand which messages they want you to concentrate on most acutely, which pieces are written most carefully, which ones are vetted at the highest levels, and therefore which signals and which messages you're supposed to be paying attention to and understanding. Okay, that's L. Second thing is, oh my God. I know what it is. Wait a minute. How about if we do a mocha instead of a latte? No. Latte. Jesus, I can't believe it. All right, let's go to T. Or forget the whole damn thing, I suppose. No, anyway. Audience. See, I'm looking out at you. A is audience. Who is this thing that you're reading aimed at? Because you read it, it doesn't mean it's aimed at you. It could be aimed at the United States, but it could equally be aimed at the government in Moscow or the government in Beijing or the South Koreans or even to their own people. So you have to know the audience in order to understand, in order to fine-tune the message. The third thing is telephone. No. The third thing, T. The third thing is timing, especially in the middle of a crisis, although not only. You want to know how quickly the response is, or whatever it is that you're reading, how quickly was it issued? A normal reaction time for the North Koreans is about 3 days, 3 or 4 days. Why? Well, they read, they hear about whatever it is that happened. Takes them a day to talk about it and write it down, and then another day to put it into their newspaper or their public relations machinery to get it out again. So when you get a 3-day turnaround, it's normal. If it's quicker than that, if it's 2 days, if it's 1 day, if it's same day, it tells you something. It tells you that this really pressed the button, that they felt an absolute need to respond quickly, either to explain their own position or to block contrary views, or because they think the situation is so dangerous and they don't want it to escalate and they're trying to cap it. That's timing. Next one is difficult, really difficult one, is tone. The reason that's so difficult is because the North Koreans use a vocabulary of the sort that your mother would never approve. It's a completely different vocabulary. People tend to mock it, make fun of it. Once you click into it, though, once that becomes your understanding of the range of their language, some of it very, very harsh, some of it not so harsh, then you can begin to make comparisons. Tone is not important for any single item. It's in comparison to what? They used to say to me, well, Carlin, is this a harsh piece? Well, compared to what? Compared to last time they talked on this issue? That's important, because if it's gotten tougher, they've made decisions to make it tougher. If it's gotten milder, they made some decisions. Why did they make those decisions? What the context? If it's the same thing, okay, it's the same thing. It doesn't tell you very much. Final point, E, L-A-T-T-E. E is my favorite. E is everything else. And the reason that's important is this sort of analysis is not what we would call content analysis, it's context analysis. The only way you understand what the North Koreans are saying is to understand the context in which they are saying it. They are making their decisions based on a number of factors, a number of things that are impinging on them. And if you don't understand those things, you won't understand why they're saying what they're saying. And what they're saying is a reflection of a decision. That's the key here. We're not just interested in words. We're trying to reverse engineer this stuff to get back to the decisions that they've made and that they are therefore communicating. Now, what does all this mean to most people? It means that when you read in a news agency report or a newspaper report, the North Koreans said whatever, warning flags have to go up. What do you mean the North Koreans said? What level did they say it? What exactly did they say? Do I have some sense of the timing of it? You can't know, as a general reader, the answer to all those questions, but you got to ask them, because otherwise you're going to fall into the trap that most reporters do of simply responding quickly and ignorantly, if I may say so, to the words in front of them, and not understand that there's a much deeper significance to those things. Unless, of course, it's just propaganda, in which case it's fluff. Okay, so we know quite a bit about North Korea. We know even more because we've had a chance to be meeting with them. And actually sitting across from the table with them informs your understanding of their public commentary, because these things move in the same direction, although as their diplomats are talking to you, you begin to understand the nuance and the depth and the shadings of what they've said. I used to have a hard time with the intelligence community on this when we were engaged in serious negotiations with the North Koreans, hundreds of hours talking to them at the table, walks in the woods, over pizza parties and beer, all sorts of occasions. And we would come back with a pretty good understanding of not only what they were telling us, but how that fit with what they were saying in public and the private messaging. And it was very frustrating because the intelligence community, most of it, tended to be dismissive, like we were being led around by the nose, like the North Koreans were just bamboozling us, like the only thing that was important was the classified information, stuff that we had paid for. Well, I was an intelligence officer for 33 years, and at the end I was the chief of the Northeast Asia Division in State Department, the Intelligence Bureau, and I had access to everything, including some very special compartments. And I can tell you that, roughly speaking, most of what crossed the desk, 60% of it, 70% of it, you could just discard. It was not worth that much. Now, what was valuable was very valuable, but just because a piece of paper had classified on it, or even the higher the classification it was, didn't mean it was that much more valuable. So the critical role of intelligence analysts then, as now, is to be able to sort through the pile of stuff, classified stuff that they get. I don't think they do that. My feeling is they still don't do as much as they should, and my feeling is that the newspapers absolutely don't understand that simply because something is marked classified doesn't make it true. That's another thing you should understand about North Korea. This reporting that the intelligence community agrees, whatever. When we were in INR, we took footnotes to a lot of, footnotes meaning exceptions, to a lot of things that the intelligence community agreed on. Why? Because we didn't think the reasoning was good, because we didn't think the evidence supported the conclusion. Now, there's always room for debate in these things. No one knows absolutely. But the fact is, a 15-to-1 vote in the intelligence community doesn't mean that truth lies on the side of the 15. I can assure you of that. Okay, what do we know? This is nitty-gritty. And for that, I'll put on my glasses. We know that the North Koreans have about 30 to 40 kilograms of plutonium, which is the prime component of the best nuclear weapons, and also highly necessary for thermonuclear weapons, of which apparently they have exploded one. which should scare the bejeebers out of everybody, really. 30 to 40 kilograms, that was the end of 2017. They may have a little bit more now, 35 to 45. That's enough for about 5 to 7 weapons, if they're just plutonium weapons. That's not a lot, but it's enough. Highly enriched uranium, which is another route to nuclear weapons, they probably have a lot more, although the estimates are very soft, at least on the outside, and I suspect on the inside as well. Why? Because we don't exactly know how many centrifuges they have. We don't know what types of centrifuges they have, and therefore there's a huge range in the estimates on how much highly enriched uranium they could have. A best guess, a good guess, is 250 to 500 kilograms at the end of last year, which is enough if you use 25 kilograms per weapon, more or less. You do the math. They have maybe 30, 35 nuclear weapons. We don't know for sure that they've fabricated that many, but given the fact that they have enough fissile material for that they've had 6 nuclear tests, 5 of which proved their design and that they could actually build it, so we have to make that assumption. How many of those can get to Reno, Nevada? Given the amount of testing that they have done of their devices and what we think we know about their missile capabilities, they can probably put almost all of the nuclear weapons we think they could make on short and medium range missiles. They can certainly cover South Korea. They can cover Japan, Okinawa. We'll leave Guam aside for the moment. Anyway, they can do an enormous amount of damage. Can they hit us? Probably not. The intercontinental ballistic missiles that they tested, two of a range that would hit the West Coast, probably wouldn't get much farther, and one which could range the entire United States if it were flown at its full range, which it wasn't. If those things actually worked, yes, they could hit the United States. Would they, at this point, do they have the capacity to put a nuclear weapon on a missile like that? Have they done enough testing of their nuclear devices to be sure they can make a small, light enough package to put on an ICBM? That's the first question. And the second one was, after only one test of this really long-range ICBM, can they be sure that it will actually work, that would go the range? The North Koreans are not stupid, and almost certainly they know they need more tests. That's what they have. That's what we think they have. There may be other estimates. I know there were estimates in the newspaper that DIA thought they could have up to 60 weapons. And there's obviously going to be room for discussion and what's the basis for that. In any case, they do have an arsenal. And it's not a tiny arsenal. It's a credible arsenal. It's an arsenal that they never should have been able to develop. And my contention is that they got as far as they did as a result of bad decisions on the part of the United States. And we'll get to that in a second. So what's the problem now? Well, as I said, we're faced with a North Korea that has a relatively potent arsenal, probably, of nuclear weapons. It has the delivery systems to take them and do terrible damage to our allies and a goodly number of our military forces in the region. If they could hit Guam, and maybe they're on the edge of being able to do that. If they could hit Guam, it would really be a serious blow to our presence in the Pacific. Now, The good thing is the North Koreans really don't want to launch a missile against us. That would be totally crazy. They're not totally crazy. So why have they been testing these things? What have they been doing? My view is that they have been trying ever since something called the Agreed Framework fell apart or was taken down by the Bush administration beginning in early 2001. And certainly since 2003, when the United States completely destroyed the Agreed Framework. Since that point, the North Koreans have determined to develop a nuclear weapons program because they thought that was the only way the United States would take them seriously. At every step of the way, in 2004, 5, 6, 7, they invited Sig Hecker, former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratories, to their nuclear center to show him how they had been developing their program. Nobody does that. People develop their nuclear programs in secret. The North Koreans didn't want it to be a secret. They wanted us to know every step of the way. In a sense, they were saying to Washington, well, we're this far. Is this where you want us to go? And every time, we didn't respond. And so they said, okay, we're going to take the next step. And that's exactly what they did. There were a number of what I call hinge points along the way. Not just inviting Sig Hecker, but subsequently when the current North Korean leader took over. Big, serious signals of the sort that I mentioned in the media. Absolutely high level, carefully worded signals to the United States in public and in private, trying to get us to stop the deterioration of the situation and maybe sit down and talk. And unfortunately, at every point along the way, we didn't do that, such that Kim Jong-un finally decided that the only way to get Washington to be serious, to pay attention, was to prove that he could reach out and touch the United States. Now, he didn't need to have a full complement of ICBMs. He just needed to be able to assert that he could hit us. And in fact, it turns out he was right. Until they launched their 2 ICBMs, first one in July 2017 and then later ones later in the year, we were just sort of floating along on this issue. We were serious, but not that serious about it. We were going to increase sanctions, but we didn't have full attention devoted to this issue. It was the moment that they launched those ICBMs that Washington took a breath and said, this is serious. This we have to fix. This we have to do something different. And that was Kim's point. That's exactly why, by the end of 2017, he made the announcement that we have now finished our nuclear program. And these are my words, not his, but it's the essence of what he said. And we can now pivot to 1, diplomacy, and 2, concentration on our economy. That's what we've seen since January. The question that you all are probably going to ask, and we need to talk about, is this serious? Is Kim serious about this? Has he made a strategic decision? And that this reflects a serious decision on the part of the leadership, which, if the United States responded correctly, could actually cap, roll back, and eventually eliminate his nuclear weapons program. Big question. And I've got some views on it. My concern is that we've begun to, how am I doing on time?
You got like 3 minutes.
So if I'm going to use the restroom, I should do it now. Okay. We've lost momentum. The situation is on the edge of getting extremely bad. We're going to have elections in this country in a couple of weeks. We don't know what the complexion of the Congress is going to be, and therefore the pressures under which the White House will find itself. The South Koreans have their own process in place with the North Koreans, which is making steady progress. The Americans are trying to put the brakes on the South Koreans, and the South Koreans are not prepared to stop. And so the gap between Washington and Seoul is growing. And I believe that in the last week, what we have seen from the North Koreans, based on my reading of the media, is a reflection of a highly charged debate within the leadership about what to do next, how to move, and have we run out of time? Such that I'm afraid we could start finding ourselves in a downward spiral, which will be more dangerous than we've ever seen. So fasten your seatbelts, and we'll take questions. Thanks. No, I have another pair. Oh, no. Never mind.
Do you need them?
No.
Okay.
No.
Excellent. Bob, that was fascinating. Thank you. And as you can imagine, there are quite a few questions, and we will expand upon your comments. Let's start with a discussion that you ended with, and we need to pull the thread a little bit more on where do we go from here. So you touched on the issue of North Korea, South Korea, and the United States.
Right.
So put on your time traveling. You're good at that. You do a lot of traveling. Put on your time traveler gear and look out. Imagine yourself 5 years from now.
Oh, God.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I know. Five weeks from now might be a challenge, but we'll give you maybe 3 years. But 5 years from now, what are we looking at in terms of the relationship, the triangle, the relationship between the United States, North Korea, and South Korea? Where is the dominant force there? Is it Korea talking to Korea? Are we left out in the cold? Or is it the United States sort of dictating where things are going? What if you had your magic wand, what would it look like? What do you think we might be going to in 5 years?
Well, a magic wand and a Ouija board are different things, right? True. In order to look ahead, let me take one step back, because where we're going has a lot to do with where we've been, or where we think we've been. The common wisdom is everything we have tried with the North Koreans for the past 25 years has failed. That is the basis for much of the policy we see today, and was the basis of the policy for the past 2 administrations at least. Those of you who have read the book, The Two Koreas, well, no, I disagree with that strongly. I think it's a false narrative. It's pernicious. It has led us down a number of blind alleys. Why? Because the agreed framework from 1993 to 2000, in fact, succeeded. It froze the North Korean nuclear program at Yongbyon, which was the only place they were producing plutonium. As a result of the agreed framework, one of their bigger reactors, which was capable of producing much more plutonium, fell into disuse and rusted away, and now they can't use. So they're stuck with a single small plutonium-producing reactor as a result of the agreed framework. Our relationship with them improved significantly. So did South Korea, so did Japan. The agreed framework had a lot of positive influence on the situation. It was a starting point for an improvement of the entire situation in Northeast Asia. Well, people say, aha, but they cheated. They cheated because they were trying to produce an enrichment capability, and that proves that you can't trust them. And the answer is no, actually. The enrichment was not really part of the agreed framework. It was bad politics, a really bad calculation on their part to go ahead with enrichment. It wasn't really a violation of the agreed framework, which wasn't a legal document anyway. But more important, thanks to the technical capabilities of the intelligence community, we caught them. We knew what they were doing very early in the process, by 1988 or so. So when we signed something with them called a joint communique in October 2000, when Kim Jong-il's sort of number 2 man came to Washington, path-breaking visit. He saw the president. He was serenaded by the Marine Band, as a matter of fact. Anyway, we signed this document. The North Koreans had not pulled wool over our eyes. And in fact, there's something in that document that we very carefully constructed in order to give us the opportunity to deal with the enrichment program when we continue the negotiations after the presidential election. And I know what was in that communique because I wrote it. And we gave it to the North Koreans 6 months early, so they knew what was in it, carefully. And here's the language, I'll read it quickly. Pledging to redouble their commitment and efforts to fulfill their respective obligations in their entirety under the agreed framework. I love those words. The U.S. and the DPRK strongly affirmed its, meaning the agreed framework's, importance to achieving peace and security on a nuclear weapons-free Korean Peninsula. To this end, the two sides agreed on the desirability of greater transparency, flashing lights, in carrying out their respective obligations under the agreed framework. In this regard, here's the hook, they noted the value of the access which removed U.S. concerns about the underground site at Kumjongni. Kumjongni was a big fuss because some aspects of the intelligence community, I won't say who, thought that the North Koreans had a hidden reactor reprocessing site under a mountain. They even made a scale model of a mountain, and when you took the top off, there was a little reactor and reprocessed. And they briefed it all around, and it was very impressive and very convincing. And we sweated blood negotiating with the North Koreans over this. And at the very beginning, when we showed them on a map where this place was that we said had this site, they said, "Are you sure?" And we said, "Yes, that's it. We want to see it." They said, "Okay, but there's nothing there." And we thought, "Oh, yeah, right. There's nothing there." Well, we got inspectors there finally. They were able to bring their equipment. They did a thorough search of the place, and there was nothing there. So reference to Kumjongni, the North Koreans know, meant that we had suspicions that they had something else, and they had to be prepared to deal with it, to open it up again. I think we would have been able to do that if the agreed framework had continued. I'm sure of it. Unfortunately, on January 21st, 2001, the agreed framework began to fall apart. Senior members of the new Bush administration were very opposed to the agreed framework, wanted to get out of it, and worked very hard for the next 2 years in order to do that. The North Koreans played into their hands, as they frequently do, and the thing went away. And for the next, from 2002 until 2018, next 16 years or so, we were in the wilderness. We were paying for our mistakes. In January 2001, the North Koreans had 0 nuclear weapons. Now they have 30 to 40. Something didn't go right. So the question is, in the future, are we going to continue this? If we're not careful, the North Koreans will be able to produce something like 6 to 7, maybe more, enough fissile material for that many nuclear weapons every year. So go from 36 to 42 to 48 to 60 to whatever. That's horrendously bad for everybody in the region, for our position, for our credibility in Northeast Asia. So we want to stop it, right? We have to make some decisions how to stop it. 5 years from now, my concern is that we will be with a North Korean arsenal of 50, 60, 70 nuclear weapons and ICBMs with proven range and capability. At which point, we will have lost the Japanese completely. The Chinese will be picking up the pieces of the tattered U.S., what's left of the U.S. position in Northeast Asia and maybe even the Pacific as a whole. Now, that's a pretty dark view, but I think things are trending in that direction. We're not there yet. There's lots of things we can do to save it. We need to stay with the South Koreans, I think. We need to understand that it's their peninsula, it's their country, it's their future. We have equities, but the fact is we can't tell them how to run their business. So we have to find a way to compromise and to coordinate our positions so that each of us gets something out of it that we need. It's not impossible to do. That's what diplomats, good diplomats, are paid to do, and they've done it in the past. The question you asked is exactly the question. If I was in INR and the assistant secretary asked me that, I would say to him, wrong question. I hated to answer questions like that because it's impossible to do. So I actually focus much more on the near term because the near term is where you're going to get to the longer term anyway. And it's good to have an idea where you want to get, but you got to know the steps that you're taking. When you pull away from the curb to go to California, you're not at California yet. And I'm talking the East Coast, not Reno, Nevada.
So true, so true. The 5 years ahead question, always difficult. Sometimes it's better if we just ask looking backwards.
Right.
What did we do right? What did we do wrong?
I needed to get that in anyway. Yeah.
So you touched on several things in your answer that I think are important for us to drill down on. Two of the big questions are the relationships outside of, yes, the whole world revolves around the United States, but outside of the United States relationship with North Korea, what is the relationship between North Korea and Japan, and why did the current leader go to China so many times recently, and what is he getting?
The Japan-DPRK relationship is many times worse than it needs to be. The Japanese need to get themselves back into the game. The entire process of stabilizing the situation in North Korea will not work unless the Japanese are positively engaged, and they're not. And under the current leadership, it's hard to see if they will be. Even though both the North Koreans and the Japanese talk about great antipathy to each other, the fact is Kim Il-sung in the 1970s was really willing to normalize relations with the Japanese, and the Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka was hoping to go to Pyongyang to do that. So historically, it's not, they can reach back to a period when they were on the edge of making progress. Again, in 2002, the Japanese Prime Minister visited Pyongyang, met with Kim Jong-il, signed an agreement, and it really looked as if they might have stabilized, provided a foundation to move ahead. Unfortunately, the question of the abductions, the North Korean abductions of Japanese citizens, really exploded in Japan when the Prime Minister came home, and that was completely wiped away by this tsunami, and they've never recovered from it. China. The North Koreans do not like the Chinese do not like the North Koreans. They never have. It's a myth that we have perpetuated, and it has caused us to misunderstand the dynamic there. Even from the days of the Korean War, the Chinese and the North Koreans were not getting along. it's gone up and down over the years because there's something I call the primacy of geography, or the cruelty of geography. North Korea sits just across the river from China. There's nothing they can do about that. They can't move. So they can only let the relationship get so bad, and then both sides have to pull it back, and they've both been able to do that. But when it gets pulled back, and there's a lot of hugging and backslapping, as there was on Kim's most recent visits, they all know that it's just a facade. And it's a necessary and useful fiction for the moment. Both sides get something out of it, but it's probably not going to last. The North Koreans do not want to be inundated by Chinese businessmen or to fall completely under the shadow of China. That's why in 1991, Kim Il-sung made a strategic decision to turn to the United States in the hopes of normalizing relations with Washington so that the U.S. and U.S. forces would provide a buffer for North Korea against a hostile Russia under Boris Yeltsin, who despised North Korea, and a completely untrustworthy Deng Xiaoping, as far as Kim Il-sung was concerned. It may be that the North Koreans are still aiming at that now. They're playing the game that they need the Chinese on their side as they engage the Americans. That's normal. The Chinese are fairly convinced that the North Koreans are playing a game to try to slip out and are trying to make sure that they can't go too far, too fast. And the question is, what are the Americans doing? Are we playing this chess game or aren't we? And I don't think that we are. We never have been. We've never quite been understood that the game in Northeast Asia was different from the thing that we're used to. Maybe because our position seemed too firm and we really were in charge. We're not. China's much more powerful and has much bigger dreams than it used to have. And so Kim and Xi Jinping at the moment think that they have things moving in their favor, although they're both chary of each other.
Thank you. Stay tuned.
Yeah, no, that's for sure.
So we're going to shift gears a little bit away from the political negotiations and touch on the problem that I think has been vexing certainly the intelligence community, certainly when I was working this issue, and that's the issue of proliferation. So can you give us some insight, and I'm going to ask you two sides of the proliferation coin here. One is the obvious one, the missiles, potentially weapons and delivery systems to Iran. Okay, or anybody else for that matter. And the other is one that you haven't touched on at all, which I'm taking Chair's prerogative of asking, which is the biological chemical potential proliferation to Syria and various other places. That has been a overwhelming concern, or was when I was in the intelligence community, of the community, and not necessarily dealt with seamlessly into the political world. So how do we deal with proliferation on all sides, both the nuclear side and the chemical biological side?
Right. Well, it's unfortunately extremely easy to proliferate plutonium. You know, you can carry it out in your pocket, and there's no way we're going to know about it.
Don't eat it. Don't eat it.
Or breathe it. Don't breathe it either. Right. We don't, I think I'm correct in saying we don't think the North Koreans have proliferated any actual material like that. However, they helped the Syrians build a plutonium production reactor completely under our noses, got away with it, at a time when we thought their production facilities were not up to, that they had been so degraded by either sanctions or the period of famine in which the economy fell apart, that no, they can't do any of this stuff anymore. Well, they could, and they did, and they slipped it out into the desert, and they almost got away with it. I think that was and I'm sure they cashed the check. That's the important thing. They did it for money. They didn't because Actually, their relations with the Syrians are better than they are with the Iranians. But they didn't do it because they loved the Syrians. They did it because they needed the cash, and I suspect they got it. Our response to it was limp-wristed. Astoundingly, I thought we should come down on them like a ton of bricks, because this is proliferation of the worst sort. This is the red line, which supposedly we drew for the North Koreans. You will never proliferate nuclear weapons, nuclear material, or nuclear technology. They did at least the second two. And so I think if you're an advisor to the leadership in North Korea these days, and you want to do something, and the leader says, "You sure you can get away with it?" The answer is, "Oh yeah, we can get away with it. We know what happened last time. Don't worry, we'll do it." And they might be doing it right now, for heaven's sakes, for all we know. So we don't have a way. That's our problem. We don't have a way physically of preventing it. The only way we have is to establish a relationship of enough importance to the North Koreans so that they realize if they do something like that, and if they get caught on it, the costs will far, far, far outweigh the benefits. We don't have anything like that now. And that's just that's the weakest of reeds for us to be relying on. I understand. We need, obviously, if we could get more people into North Korea, if we could be working with their scientists and at their nuclear sites, you would learn a lot more. You would begin to understand where the decision-making sits, where the technology sits, where the fissile material sits. You would have a much better chance of monitoring this stuff. We can't do any of that stuff right now. We're on the outside. And that's why we need to be establishing this relationship. CW, nightmare. They have it, they probably have it, their forces on the front lines probably are following Soviet doctrine and have CW shells integrated into their artillery units. People talk about their tubes being able to hit Seoul, however many thousand. No one's counting the CW that's going to be going in too. It's the worst nightmare you can imagine.
How about BW?
I don't.
Biological.
Yeah. When I was in, we knew very, 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 very little about their BW program. So if people know more about it, they would be more able to talk about it than I can.
Yeah, those two are equal nightmares right now. So we've touched on a lot of the political issues. We've touched on the policy. We've touched on the negotiations. We've covered a lot of ground here, and you've given us phenomenal insight. Let's go back a little bit to where you started and a little bit of the discussion we had last night, and talk a little bit more about the social issues. Can you give us an insight into what is it like for the average Korean? Can they travel? Can they leave the country? Can they get a citizenship somewhere else? Would they want to leave if they could? Are there things going on, and how is the dynamic of the individual Korean, rather than the leadership, changing and evolving right now?
It's a key question. It's one that doesn't get a lot of attention because so much attention is focused on the nuclear program and the missile program. When I left INR, my view was we needed to have less spies in the leadership and more spies in the bazaar, because I could sense even then that the changes that were going on in North Korea were going to have a big influence on the place. Why? Because the leadership cannot simply ignore what's going on at that level. They know that their future is intimately bound up on what's going on at that level. They're either going to have to control it or channel it, encourage it, deal with it, something. It's going to either bite them or take them on the wave to as I said at the opening, look, life in North Korea is really tough for most of the people. But I was in South Korea in the 70s, and life in South Korea was really tough for most of the people, both economically and politically. When I was stationed in North Korea, my brother-in-law, who is Korean-Japanese, was snatched at the airport and disappeared. And we didn't know where he was. His wife was frantic. The station looked around and couldn't find him in the South Korean intelligence net. Finally discovered that he was being held by the Defense Security Command, which is the meanest of the meanest of the mean in South Korea. He was tortured for days. He was hung upside down. He was given water torture. They finally decided he wasn't who he was. Had a doctor come in and prettied him up and said, "Are you okay? Is everything okay? Where would you like us to take you?" And he said, "Well, my brother-in-law works for the U.S. Embassy." And they said, "Oh, okay, we'll take him there." These guys had just tortured this man. And they're going to take him back to the U.S. Embassy. Why? Because they have such chutzpah. They knew they could get away with this crap, and no one would question them. So he showed up on my doorstep one day. Asked him what happened. We were aghast. Turns out, while they were questioning him, they had this big chart, a spider web of relationships, who he knew, who his relatives were. It had my wife and my 2-year-old daughter on that chart. And I went screaming into the political counselor. And I said, if these bastards come within 20 yards of my wife, there's going to be an international incident. I guarantee you. He said, "You're right. We shouldn't stand for this, but there's not much we can do about it right now. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back with your brother-in-law to the airport. I want you to accompany him to the plane side. I want you to walk in front of him. And if anybody walks up to him that looks like they're going to do damage, you say, 'I'm from the American Embassy, this far and no farther.'" And I said, "Oh, really?" Luckily, nothing happened. But the lesson to me was, yes, life was tough. People who stepped over the line, and there were plenty of them, suffered for it. Peasants in South Korea had a tough life. They were dependent on the weather. The weather's not good, the crop fails, they have a hard time. So peasants are peasants. That's the first thing. Life is tough. Koreans are used to it. As far as the political aspects of it go, I don't think it's easing that much, but I think the economy is getting better enough for enough people, even if only marginally, that they have decided that they can live with the strictures, and they can even push back. We have seen videos of women in the markets screaming at and pushing back Ministry of Security officers because they have been interfering with their ability to earn money. And rather than take out a billy club and hit this woman to the ground, the guy steps back. Why? Because they know that this is dynamite, that they're going to have to deal with this either differently or just let it slide by and hope nobody noticed. So that dynamic is changing. It's going to continue to change, and to some extent it's at the encouragement of the regime. Where's it going to stop? We don't know. It could go further if North-South relations improve, if Kim Il-sung is able to argue with his military that they no longer need some of the public security measures, that in order for the economy to do better, people need to be able to travel more freely. There's been some easing of that. It used to be very strict. It's not as strict as it was. If things get better with the Chinese, they're liable to go back to a period of a few years ago when literally hundreds of thousands of North Koreans were going into China, either to conduct business or to take classes. And these people all come back having seen, a developed world. And there's no way of vacuuming their brains when they get back. And so this is implanted in the society as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. There is a proposal out there for Pope Francis to visit North Korea. Do these kinds of high-level visits help, or do they confuse the situation even more?
Well, you got to admit, Kim Jong-un has a lot of chutzpah. And so far he's been getting away with it. Look, he's been on the dance floor with Donald Trump. He's had 3 meetings with the South Korean president, took the South Korean president to the peak of the sacred mountain in North Korea and had his picture taken, met 3 times with Xi Jinping, probably going to meet with Putin. Why not the Pope? The Pope is next. Don't forget, there's a large Catholic population in South Korea. The South Korean Catholic Church, in fact, during periods of dialogue, was deeply involved, North-South dialogue, was deeply involved and encouraging of the South Korean government to let the Catholic Church play a larger role. The Pope played a role in U.S.-Cuban rapprochement of some sort. So it's got potential, I think. I don't think it's going to solve everything. It's got potential. It might conceivably push things on the margins ahead. There'll be a lot of guffawing about the functioning Catholic Church in Pyongyang and what a facade it is and everything. That's all sort of unimportant. What's important is how the Pope listens to Kim Jong-un, whether he establishes some sort of a personal relationship, and whether that becomes a channel which helps us move this process out of the mud that it's currently in.
Excellent.
And I haven't forgotten that.
So just before we close, I know, Bob, you have a very dear friend named Frank Church, who has authored some amazing detective stories about North Korea. So perhaps you could, on behalf of your friend, just share with our audience what Inspector O is all about.
Well, as I understand it, from many conversations with the author, this is an effort. It's an effort to do 2 things. One is simply to take the format of a noir detective story and throw it into North Korea and see if it works. See if you can get a Humphrey Bogart-like detective operating in the North Korean environment. And it actually works. But secondly, it's a chance to provide insight into North Korean thinking, into why every North Korean doesn't defect. It's home. North Korea is home. Those roots go back before the communist days. There is a pre-communist North Korea that lots of North Koreans still remember. Fewer, obviously, as the generations change, but they still remember it. There are South Koreans from North Korea whose home villages are up there. It's extremely important to Koreans. How does the bureaucracy work in North Korea? Like every damn bureaucracy in the world. Frustrating, complicated, ridiculous. And this is an opportunity to sort of shed a light on that. How many books are there? There's 6 of them.
There are 6 of them.
The third one, it's called Bamboo and Blood, takes place during the famine in North Korea. And I think it gives you a good picture of how incredibly bleak it was to be alive in Pyongyang in those years. And the trauma, the emotional trauma that people had to suffer as they watched relatives, dying of hunger, and there was nothing they could do about it. So anyway, it's an effort to get at a subject in a way so you can swallow the medicine, the bitter medicine with the sweet at the same time. Maybe get a detective story that will baffle you. A lot of people complain. I can't understand where this was going. That's good. That's the whole point.
So for those of you who would like a snippet of life in North Korea, I highly recommend Inspector O series. You can get them on Amazon. I downloaded them on my Kindle. And if you have any other questions for Frank Church, I'm sure Bob would be willing to entertain those as well. So with that, Bob, thank you, for a wonderful, enlightening program.
Can I say one thing? For those of you who are interested in what it's like negotiating with North Korea, there's this monograph that we put out at Stanford University called Negotiating with North Korea, 1992 through 2007. It's on the website. It's on the CSAC website. You can get it. From 11 years away, it's an interesting read to see what opportunities existed and what opportunities we passed up in that period.
I'll put a link to that in the summary. So with that, thank you very much. We'll see you the first week in December. Stay tuned for our next program announcement.